Sì, anch'io sono. Però non so se ci senti. Alzare. Eh? Posso partire? Mi sentono? Ok. Buongiorno a tutti, grazie di essere qui. Adesso poi parleremo prevalentemente in inglese, però almeno vi do due linee guida adesso solo in italiano. Noi abbiamo grande piacere di avere qui con noi Guy Standing, che è una delle poche persone che ha scritto cose davvero di respiro globale su quello che sta succedendo al mondo del lavoro. C'è questo libro che è uscito, si chiama Precari in italiano, che è uscito ormai già da qualche anno, perché appunto è stato scritto nel 2011 nella prima edizione, e poi nel 2012 è uscito in Italia, e se voi lo leggete avrete l'impressione che sia un instant book, pur essendo così ricco, perché è un libro che come dire, coglie moltissimi dei problemi che adesso svilupperemo, ma che sono sostanzialmente che forse quello che sta succedendo non è che la crisi ha creato un po' di disoccupati, non è così semplice, quindi non basta un po' di crescita per tornare indietro. Quello che sta succedendo è che sta cambiando profondamente la struttura del mercato del lavoro e la struttura del nostro rapporto con il lavoro, e che quindi bisogna affrontare una serie di questioni. Le affronteremo appunto con Guy Standing, che insegna alla SOAS a Londra, che scrive molti articoli sul Guardian e che ha fondato il Basic Income Network, o è tra i fondatori, e che poi ci spiegherà appunto anche dal lato degli ammortizzatori sociali, ci dirà cosa pensa degli ammortizzatori sociali universali, del reddito minimo di cittadinanza, eccetera. E poi abbiamo Anna Zilli dell'Università di Udine, che è una, come scherzavamo prima, è una ricercatrice precaria, ma anche una ricercatrice sul precariato, che ha lavorato, mi stava facendo vedere prima i dati, a uno studio davvero impressionante sul mercato del lavoro italiano, su come è cambiato in questi anni della crisi, trovando le conferme empiriche, che sono quelle che poi, appunto, di solito non i giuristi, ma gli economisti cercano sempre, e quindi questa volta i due piani si mettono insieme, dimostrando che quello che ci dice Standing è cruciale e va in qualche modo affrontato. Poi alla fine chiederò a tutti e due di arrivare a un punto politico, cioè di spiegarci come questi cambiamenti sociali ed economici porteranno a un inevitabile cambiamento, anche politico, inevitabile, forse. Comunque, noi adesso parleremo prevalentemente in inglese, poi avete le traduzioni, se qualcuno poi vuole fare domande, eccetera, in italiano, poi leggeriamo a Standing. So, Professor Standing, thanks so much for being here. It's a great pleasure to introduce you to the audience, and I give you the floor to explain what is the precariat, how it is changing our society, and maybe if you can explain to these young people how their future look like and how they can survive being precariat.
Okay, well, first of all, apologies for speaking in English. And I know that the translators have actually listened to some of my talks and have got all the key words, so you should get most of it. I also apologize for having a cold. One of the problems about working on the precariat is that it is a global phenomenon, and I find that the books have been translated into numerous languages, and many of the places where the precariat is growing fastest happen to have very cold winters. And I've just come from Scandinavia, and I've caught a cold because it was minus 15 up there. I've just finished a new book, the third book on the precariat, but I'm going to concentrate mainly on the second book, the Precariat Charter, which exists in Italian as well as the first one. And the preface of the third book begins by talking about a certain man, Johann Rupert is his name. He has a wealth of approximately $8 billion gained from inherited gold mines and ownership of Cartier and Vacheron, these luxury goods. And he was speaking at a Financial Times conference in Monaco. Beautiful hotel, beautiful people, jewelry everywhere, you know. And he said he was suffering from nightmares. He couldn't sleep. And the reason he couldn't sleep is that he was imagining that everybody out there were getting up in arms and coming after him and chasing him and killing him. And he said, you know, they would be right. I don't know what his audience said in response, but you can check it up on Google. It happened. The other side of the Atlantic, where I was invited to speak in Silicon Valley, a certain man also described himself as one of the 001 percenters. In other words, a multi-billionaire. He said he is extremely worried about himself because he imagines the culottes and the pitchforks coming in his direction. And he said it without knowing about Mr. Rupert in Monaco. Now, our hope is that a lot more of these people will have nightmares. Now, the second point I want to make by way of introduction is the way I start a whole analysis. Two premises. Every age has its stupidity about what is work and what is not work. And if you look at the books, the starting point conceptually is that the 20th century was the most stupid of all. All work that was not labor, and it's difficult, the translation of these words, but you're getting it, disappears statistically, conceptually, from our textbooks. And every feminist, and I hope we're all feminists, every feminist should shout every time somebody uses the word work when really what they mean is labor. To give the simplest example, if I have enough money to hire a housekeeper, national income goes up, employment goes up, economic growth goes up, and the unemployment rate goes down. If she then is stupid enough to marry me, and she continues to do exactly the same work, national income goes down, employment goes down, economic growth goes down, and the unemployment rate goes up. Now, you cannot get more stupid or sexist than that. But that is still how the politicians and the sociologists and economists treat work. Put that aside, but it's an important aspect of the whole analysis of the precariat. The second premise is that we are in the middle of a global transformation. I hope most of you are familiar with Karl Polanyi's book, The Great Transformation. Today, we're in the middle of the process of the painful construction of a global market system. Polanyi was talking about national markets. But we are in the middle of the development of a global market system. And the first phase, the disembedded phase that Polanyi talked about, just as with his great transformation, has been dominated by financial capital and has involved the development and imposition around the world of what we call neoliberal economics. Neoliberalism has a very clear definition. It's not just a pejorative term. It stems from Hayek and von Mises and Milton Friedman, a whole school of Chicago thinkers. And essentially it is about the individualization, liberalization of all markets, the commodification of everything that can be commodified, and the privatization of everything that can be privatized. Now, in the development of neoliberalism, the defining feature is none of those. The defining feature is that deliberately and systematically, ever since they have been in control of global economic policy, there has been a systematic dismantling of all institutions of social solidarity, all institutions that stand against the market. Because from their perspective, any collective body is distorting the market. So what we have seen in this era of neoliberal dominance is a dismantling of many of the parameters of our society. And paradoxically, one of those is the firm. The firm as a parameter. When I was a student, it was regarded as a parameter of society. But now the firm is commodified, subject to fracturing, takeovers, mergers, restructuring globally, with many multinationals having 50, 60 plants which they can adjust as they wish. But we've also seen a dismantling of occupational bodies. The occupational guilds that defined how people lived and worked and entered a profession or a craft and developed through a body that gave them the values and the ethics and standards, they've been dismantled. It isn't deregulation. That is the wrong word. There has been state re-regulation through licensing and through all forms of state control, a theme that I developed in an earlier book. But also dismantled as a system standing against the market has been the education system. The education system traditionally was seen as outside the market, particularly at tertiary level. It was something that gave a community of ethics and gave you your culture and philosophy and values. It was meant to be outside the market. But increasingly, it has been commodified. The teachers have been commodified. The students have been commodified. The diplomas and degrees have been commodified. And has been a fundamental part of the neoliberal agenda. Another point, of course, is that we've been undergoing a technological revolution with electronics and so on, which has facilitated the transfer of capital and labor globally. Now, if there's a Hamlet in my story, it's the next fact. In this period of the last 30 years, the world's labor supply, the supply of workers to the global market, has quadrupled. That means an extra 2 billion people have become part of a globalizing labor market. And all of those extra 2 billion have come from societies habituated to a level of income 1/50th of what an Italian or a British worker would have accepted as the norm 20 or 30 years ago. Now, you don't have to have a PhD in economics to realize that if that happens, you're putting huge downward pressure on our wages. Obviously. Especially if productivity is rising much faster in the emerging market economies than it can do in Italy or Britain or the United States, right? So we've seen the beginnings of a global convergence of wages. Gradually, as wages rise in China and India and Indonesia and so on, ours have been falling. It's a reality of the past 30 years. But what is most fundamental is that we have been experiencing the collapse of the 20th century income distribution system. Everywhere in the world, the share of national income going to capital has been shooting up, and the share going to labor has been shooting down. Ironically, the country where that has happened most is China. The share of national income going to labor in China has fallen by 20 percentage points, an extraordinary drop in 20 or 30 years. But you have had a growth of inequality that in terms of social incomes is greater than the growth of wage inequality in our countries. The reason being that part of the dismantling of the old social compact, the old social democratic compact of the 20th century, is that workers in general have been losing access to non-wage benefits and to rights-based state benefits. And they've been losing it more than wages demonstrate. And we've had some very strange things taking place. The way to look at it is to have a picture in your mind of a snake. You know how a snake opens its jaws? You know, the top one. Well, it used to be the case that when productivity went up, wages went up in parallel. In the past 30 years around the world, in country after country, when productivity goes up, the jaws of the snake open because real wages stagnate. That's never happened before. The second snake is alongside. And the second snake has it that it used to be the case that when employment went up, real wages rose. Something we took as obvious when I was a student. Not anymore. Another snake's jaws have been opening. Employment goes up, real wages go down. Go to Spain, they'll tell you about it. Go most places. A third very strange snake is there too. This third snake is particularly common in my country, but in a number of other countries as well. It used to be the case that when employment went up, tax revenue from employment also went up. Oh. If you have taught that as an undergraduate, then you say, well, that's obvious. You know, not anymore. Today, employment goes up in many countries and tax revenue from employment goes down. Partly because instead of high-wage jobs, they're being substituted for low-wage jobs below tax thresholds. Now, the fourth snake is the most ironic of all. It used to be the case that when profits went up, wages went up. You've guessed it. Another jaw has opened. Now, we have moved into an era of rentier capitalism. John Maynard Keynes, who was the greatest economist of the 20th century, wrote back in the 1930s that there would be a euthanasia of the rentier. In other words, he'd be killed off because capitalism would become super efficient. On the contrary to Thomas Piketty's story, what has actually been happening is the share of income going to rentiers who own property has been shooting up much faster than profits from production. There's been a huge shift to rent extraction. And most of all, it has involved intellectual property. In the last 20 years, the income from patents, registered patents, has increased 7-fold. I hope your income has gone up 7 times. Mine hasn't. rentiers have been streaming ahead. Each year now, patents guarantee 20 years of monopoly income for anybody who registers them, and over $10 trillion of income go to patent holders. It's an extraordinary change. And what has happened alongside the growth of patents and this vast amount of income is that plutocratic corporations like Apple and Google and IBM and the pharmaceuticals have become patent hoovers, buying up patents from the little man who invents something and putting them all together as a portfolio of patents, multiplying the income that they gain. It is a huge shift. But alongside the patents, there are over 3,000 trade agreements which guarantee all these patents for the corporations that own them. 3,000 of these agreements. It's impossible to keep track of these new trade agreements. They are not trade agreements. They are protecting property rights. Alongside patents, you have copyright. Now, copyright law has been developed around the world in a remarkably quick time. So much is subject to copyright. But wait for it. It used to be that if you invented a piece of poetry or music or something, you had copyright for a limited period. Today, under the new rules around the world, your copyright guarantees you a monopoly flow of income, wait for it, for 50 years after your death. I don't know what you're going to do with it, whether you're up there or down there, how you're going to spend it. But imagine, 50 years after your death. I mean, this is ridiculous, all right? But that's the reality. Now, rent and all the intellectual property is really part of the current crisis. In addition, we have corporate subsidies given by governments which dwarf the amount of money spent on social policies. Every year in the United States, over $100 billion is given by the federal government to corporations in subsidies. And don't think we don't do the same. We do. And of course, there are tax breaks for the corporations. I found out last week a remarkable thing. When I heard this, I thought that must be wrong. That must be wrong. So I went and really checked it out. The 6 biggest corporations in Great Britain, the 6 household name corporations, did not pay 1 penny or 1 cent in tax last year, even though they made £30 billion of profits. Because of all the little... Right. So we have a situation of growing inequality, growing rentier capitalism, and one little statistic highlights what a crazy world we're living in now. 10 years ago, the richest 300 or so people in the world owned half the wealth of the world. Today, the richest 100 own half the wealth of the world. It's crazy. That's the reality. Now, underneath this pattern of income inequality, the class fragmentation that I develop in the books is the real story that is setting our political contours. We have a plutocracy, not a top 1%, a top 0.001%, something like that. Then you have an elite serving them. Then you have a salariat with long-term employment. And you have a group I call proficients. Now, all of these top groups are earning part of their income or all of their income from rents, from various forms of rental income. So they are detached from the rest of society in a material sense. Below them, in terms of income, average income, is the old proletariat. The old, stable, manual workers who worked full-time in factories and so on. They're shrinking everywhere and have no political strength. Many of them are falling into the precariat below them, and before I define the precariat, even further below into a lumpen precariat. And that's the first point I want to make about the precariat. The precariat is not an underclass. The precariat is wanted by multinational capital and by the system that has developed in the last 30 years. How do you define the precariat? First, the precariat has distinctive relations of production. You can use a Marxist term or you can use another term. It doesn't matter. Distinctive ways of working, if you like. People in the precariat are being habituated to internalize a life of unstable labor and unstable living, subject to being casualized in temporary jobs, interns, indirect labor, all the categories that you know about that we've seen. For me, this is the least important aspect of the precariat. That's the aspect that newspapers and commentators comment most of all on. Very interestingly, the big new thing there is the growth of what I call taskers. These are people who are being contracted to do little bits of work online. Not just the Uber and Airbnb, the ones that are known, but there are thousands developing. And estimates within the industry suggest that over the next 10 years, 1 in every 3 labor transactions will be done online. So you won't be an employee, you won't be self-employed, you'll be controlled by an app of some sort. This is a new phenomenon that is profoundly changing the global labor process. Second, and more importantly in terms of understanding the precariat, people in the precariat have no occupational identity, no narrative to give to their lives. They also have no corporate identity. They don't enter a firm and expect to stay there for the whole of their life and define themselves in that corporation. And there are no paths of social mobility. We have a lower rate of social mobility moving up in the income spectrum than ever used to be the case. It's a remarkable phenomenon. And part of that has to do with the fact that within every occupation, within every firm, within every industry, the stratification by class is proceeding. So you have an elite in academia, you have a salariat, and you have a precariat. And the precariat very rarely goes up into the salariat. So you have that, and then you find that this is the first emerging class in history. I think you'll find this is true. The first emerging class where the level of education on average is higher than the level of labor they're expected to do. It's never happened before. And the final aspect of this first dimension is very important because it defines the existence of the precariat. There is a rising ratio of work to labor if you're in the precariat. You have to do a lot of work for labor. You have to spend a lot of time searching. You have to spend a lot of time retraining. And then you find that the retraining you did then is all obsolescent, so you've got to do more retraining. You spend a lot of time waiting around, because waiting around is part of your job. You have to spend a lot of time working for the state, filling in forms, doing more forms, queuing. And this multitude of activities leads to what I call the precariatized mind. You don't know what to do. You don't know what is the optimum use of your time. Should I do a little more of this or a little more of that? Should I do this? Should I do that? What? you have no control. And that, of course, if any psychologist here would tell us, leads to a loss of capability to think rationally. The second dimension is that the precariat has distinctive relations of distribution. Good. I always have a rule that anybody's phone going off, he has to buy me a beer afterwards. The distinctive relations of distribution means that the precariat has to rely almost entirely on money wages. It doesn't get access to those benefits. It doesn't get access to state benefits. And it is also losing access to informal networks of support. Because part of the crisis that we're facing is the privatization of the commons, taking away informal mechanisms and institutions of support. Another feature is that if you are in the precariat, you are always on the edge of unsustainable debt. This is the first class in history which is being systematically exploited through debt, as well as through the labor process. Again, you don't have to be a radical Marxist to see the extractions that are taking place. And of course, around the world, because of the development of means testing, selective and targeted and conditional social assistance, millions of people are exposed to poverty traps. In Northern Europe, in Sweden, where I've just been, or in Denmark, the problem today is that if you have access to benefits, state benefits, if you're unemployed or something, and you go from those benefits into a low-paying job, you are effectively paying a marginal tax rate of 80% or more. In other words, you lose more, lose 80% of what you gain. Now, if the middle class had to pay 80% tax rate, what do you think they would be saying? They wouldn't like it very much. But if you're in the precariat, these are realities. But the situation is even worse than that. Because increasingly, the precariat is exposed to precarity traps as well. Different forms, but the main one is this. Supposing you lose a low-paying job today, do you think you start receiving state benefits tomorrow morning? You're joking. Usually people have to wait not days, not weeks, but sometimes months before they get it. Imagine, run out of your friends, run into debts, you lose your accommodation, your child is sick, and then you suddenly get your benefit. And then an employment official comes along and says, you have to take a job the other side of Udine. It's paying a minimum wage, no benefits. It may only last 2 or 3 weeks. You've got to take it. Do you think that it's rational to take such a job? If you do think it's rational, don't take my economics courses. Because, of course, you would be out of your job in 2 or 3 weeks and then have to start all over again, trying to prove that the slippers under the bed are not your lovers, blah, blah, blah. You know, all these things. These are the realities. And the third dimension of the precariat, in my view, is the most important. Here we have a situation where a growing number of people are in a class which has distinctive relations to the state. This doesn't mean to government, to the state. What we're seeing is the growth of what we call in English denizens. It's non-translatable. We've discussed it. Here, you're getting a description. A denizen was a real concept in British medieval. It referred to people going into a town and being given a more limited range of rights than the citizens of a town. But this is the first time in history when millions of people who were citizens are losing rights of citizenship. They're losing civil rights. They don't get access to justice. They're losing social rights. They don't get access to benefits. They're losing cultural rights because they cannot belong to a community that gives them a sense of belonging. They're losing political rights because they don't see in the spectrum of politics representation that with their values and aspirations. And they're losing economic rights because they cannot practice what they're qualified to do. It's a perfect storm of loss of rights. And this leads to what I think is the most important aspect. If you're in the precariat, you are a supplicant. You have to ask for favors. You have to ask for help. You have to ask for somebody to make a decision in your favor. You have to rely on charity, informal, formal, or whatever. And this, of course, is stigmatizing, dehumanizing, and so on. But we are at a very interesting point. Because the precariat I've described as the new dangerous class. And it's a dangerous class because, first of all, it is suffering from 4 phenomena. Anxiety, chronic anxiety. Anomie, the sociological concept of anomie, a despair of escape. Alienation, because you cannot do what you want to do and you have to do what you don't want to do. And anger. The anger is growing out there. But at the moment, the sense of relative deprivation that characterized the precariat is still mediated because it is internally divided. The first part of the precariat is what I call the atavists. These are people who are falling out of old working class communities and traditions and so on. Their parents had occupations of working class pride. Steel workers, car workers, dockers, whatever it might be. They don't have that. But they also don't have a university education or whatever. And so they are easily listening to the voices of the neo-fascist populists. You have yours, other countries have theirs. Donald Trump has his own weird way of looking at things. But they're growing everywhere and they're luring part of the precariat to them. It's a very dangerous phenomenon that we're witnessing. The second part of the precariat consists of the migrants, the minorities, the disabled, the Roma, the whatever, who tend to be nostalgic. They don't have a sense of home. They don't have a home. But they keep their heads down politically, except for when the pressures get too great and there's an explosion, like there was around Stockholm when I happened to be there last year, when suddenly it's too much. And those days explode. That's another form of danger. We saw it in various places. The third part of the precariat consists of those who go to university or college. They have an education. And when they went to university, they were promised a future. But they come out realizing they've just bought a lottery ticket. The lottery ticket costs more and more and is worth less and less. They are denied a future. And as such, they are angry, but they're looking intuitively for a new progressive politics for the 21st century. And this group in the precariat is an exciting part because in its quest, it is realizing that it doesn't suffer from the false consciousness of laborism of the 20th century. It doesn't think that a job is going to give you nirvana and happiness. Exactly. It realizes that we have to explore outside our jobs for our sense of development and capabilities and so on. And the defining difference between the precariat, this part of the precariat, and the old proletariat is that the primary antagonist is not the employer. Some employers here might be glad of that. It's not the employer, because the employer today or tomorrow is going to be changing. You know, I don't know who's my employer coming up. The primary antagonist is the state. The institutions that are provoking this insecurity and so on. So we've reached the stage where politically we are on the cusp of the second phase of the global transformation. It's not definite, it's only possible. We could have a dark age, a politics of inferno coming towards us. And we will do unless we mobilize and become more progressive. But the interesting thing is that in every forward march towards the Enlightenment, towards more equality, to more freedom, to more fraternity, the great trinity of the French Revolution, there are certain phases. And the first phase is that the emerging class must develop a sense of recognition. So that instead of when you look in the mirror in the morning, you see a failure, a person with limitations, who's no good. You look in the mirror in the morning and you say, hey, there are a lot of people out there just like me. We have a common experience. And it's not me who's failing, it's the structures and processes that I've got to confront. That sense of recognition, I believe, was tremendously advanced in 2011 with the hundreds of mass protests, the Occupy, the Indignado, the Arab Spring, all of these movements. Many commentators say they're all been failures. I think, on the contrary, the hundreds of mass protests have advanced the subjectivity of the precariat. The sense that we are a group and we can confront the structures facing us. It's a wonderful development. It is a necessary development. But the second phase, beyond that, is that we must struggle for a new sense of representation. Because in none of the institutions in our societies is the precariat actually inside representing itself with a voice, a collective and individual voice. I've said this many times when I'm invited by the trade unions, and they say, what's the precariat all about? We stand for the precariat. And I say, with respect, you don't. And they, you know, the younger ones in the union movements do get it. The older ones all get very angry at this point. They start shouting at me or something. But they don't get it. They don't have the aspirations of the precariat. They think if everyone had full-time stable jobs, everybody all happy. They don't understand. But this sense of representation in every part of the state is something that we need to struggle for. And the third, where we've just begun, is a struggle, of course, for redistribution. But what are we struggling for? If I talk to a group in the precariat about the old Marxist struggle for the means of production, they'd all rush for the bar, right? And I'd come with them. Because that old Marxist clarion call is ridiculous. Many of the taskers own their own means of production, right? The precariat has a struggle for the key assets in society of the 21st century. What are those key assets? There are 5. And this I fed into the second book because all the articles in the Precariat Charter that I've drawn up are intended to advance the redistribution of these key assets. What are they? The first is security. The inequality of security today is much greater than the inequality of income. I'd love to see some empirical ways of doing it, but we did try it in a particular book. In other words, if you're up here, you have total security. The poor old Rupert, he can relax. His billions will stop him from the pitchforks. If you're down in the precariat, you have no security at all. None. Zero. The second is control of time. Time is an asset. Again, if you're up here, you can have your control of time. You may not do so. You may be stupid enough not to do so, but you can. If you're down here, you have no control of your time. No control at all. So we need a politics of time. The third is access to quality space, quality places, quality things. If you're up here, you can have access to your holidays and your vacation homes and blah, blah, blah. Down here, you have no access. You have shrinking commons. The next asset is education. If you're up here in the elite, you can still get access to an elitist education that will teach you your culture, your arts, your philosophy, your history. If you're down in the precariat, none of those get taught to you. It's a waste of time because that's not going to get you a job. So don't learn your history. Don't learn your culture. So you get up and they have so little knowledge of civics that they vote for the Donald Trumps or the whatevers. Because they don't have the education. We need a strategy for the decommodification of education and the redistribution of real education. The next key asset is financial knowledge. In a modern 21st century society, if you don't have access to financial advice and financial knowledge, you will be really savagely screwed. Excuse me. It's important. We need public access. And the fifth, of course, is we need a strategy for the redistribution of rental income. All that rental income that's going to people who've never done any work to get that money. We need a strategy. Now, I've talked long enough, and the charter that I drew up in the second book has 29 articles which are a progressive strategy from the perspective as what I understand as the precariat. If any of you in this room drew up a charter, it would differ. It's bound to be the case. But we need to be thinking about progressive politics and progressive thinking from the perspective of the precariat, not from an old perspective of a society that's disappeared. And among the 29 articles, number 25 is something that I've been struggling for 30 years. And I urge those of you who've not been engaged on the topic to at least think about it in the context of today. My argument is that unless we move in the direction of a universal basic income as a right of all of us, we are not going to do anything effective to give people security or redistribute income. Now, we have a global movement. Everybody can join. There's been Italia as part of Bien, and we've been pushing forward. And in the last 2 or 3 years, something in the water is changing. Because a huge number of people, respectable people, are suddenly inventing the claim that they've just thought up a good new idea. Basic income. And I said to a Brazilian senator friend of mine recently, I said, this is excellent. This is excellent. Blessed is the child who has many foster fathers, because he will have lots of Christmas presents. But we are in the situation where every day some new person comes out and says, we have to do this. It's great. And we are in a phase where we are now moving in the direction where governments and local authorities are experimenting The government of Finland has just announced that it's going to do a pilot of basic income. And the Prime Minister has just come out in favour. 5 years ago, that would have been unimaginable. A billionaire in California has just put up millions to do a pilot in the United States. We have just done 3 pilots in India where we provided a basic income to thousands of men, women, and children. Sonia Gandhi said to us before we started, she said, "You're crazy, you're wasting money. They'll just spend it on alcohol and tobacco." So we provided 6,000 people in 9 areas with a basic income for 18 months. We produced a book on the results. Basically, it showed huge improvements in nutrition, sanitation, schooling, health, huge increases in economic activity. People worked more, not less, were more productive when they worked. Huge improvements in social equity, because the disabled, the women, the frail benefited more than the other groups. And most fundamentally of all, and something I hadn't really expected when we started, the emancipatory effect of the basic income was greater than the money value of the basic income. People started to pay down their debts, people started to save, people started to be in control of their lives, and they developed what we are always saying that is wonderful, the ability to say no. And I give you 2 examples by way of conclusion. And it could happen in Italy or any other place. Don't think it just applies to India or Africa where we've done it. I went to one village when we started, and I noticed that all the young women were wearing veils. And I said, "Come on, we've got to take their pictures because they have to have a card to get the basic income." So they had to go into a hut with women, have their photos taken. We couldn't see their faces. 6 months later, I went to the same village, and I said to a friend of mine who was working on our team, I said, "Have you noticed something?" He said, "Oh." I said, "Look around." I said, "All the women are not wearing veils." And he said, "Yeah, that's right." So we called over some of the women, they were shy, and then they said, "Yeah, but before we had to do what the elders tell us. Now we have the basic income. We can do what we want." And the other example is a pilot we did in Namibia. Again, the last time I went to the village and I asked some young women, I said, "What's the best thing that you have experienced as a result of the basic income?" They giggled, didn't want to give me an answer, but then one plucked up the courage and she said, "Well, look, before, when the men used to come down from the hills at the end of the month with their pockets full of money, we had to say yes. Now we say no." That ability to say no is a very important emancipatory factor. And we have to think about changing the distribution system so that people have more control of their time, more security, and more ability to combine different forms of work and develop themselves. It's not utopian to imagine this. It can be done, but it requires political courage on our behalf. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Professor Stanley. It was extremely inspiring, sometimes scaring, but we know that the situation is serious. So I would like to ask to Anna Zilli to help us to understand how these ideas match with the change in the Italian labor market, because from a certain perspective it seems that we are seeing some kind of redistribution. We just change the law to fire people, so we are redistributing insecurity between young people to the less young people. Non so, volete parliamo in italiano? Parliamo in italiano?
Sì.
Ok, allora parliamo in italiano. Abbiamo appena fatto la modifica dell'articolo 18, che da un certo punto di vista è stata presentata, come dire, condividiamo anche un po' i rischi dell'insicurezza, non è tutto sui precari, sui giovani, ma bisogna, come dire, spalmarlo. L'austerità viene presentata come una redistribuzione di sacrifici fiscali dalle generazioni precedenti che hanno speso troppo, adesso è ora che in qualche modo con le tasse paghino. Insomma, cosa sta succedendo in Italia? Qual è l'analisi di questi fenomeni che Guy Standing ha raccontato a livello globale, come si riscontrano in Italia e appunto soprattutto sul mercato del lavoro?
Intervenire dopo il professor Standing non è facile, soprattutto perché mi alzo in piedi, mi piace vedervi in faccia, soprattutto le giovani generazioni e i colleghi, e i non colleghi, e i precari e i non precari, e le mamme e le quasi mamme. Io sono una giurista e i giuristi in genere sognano poco, vedono poco il futuro, guardano molto il passato, cercano molto di ricostruire la storia per poter vedere un po' dove si può intervenire, dove suggerire una modifica, dove poi invece una modifica può essere dirompente. Io non posso dimenticare però che il diritto del lavoro è un diritto di protezione. Io mi occupo di diritto del lavoro. Labor, non work. Io mi occupo e mi sono sempre occupata dei salariati, di chi lavora, non di chi il lavoro non ce l'ha. Ed è a poco che i giuristi del lavoro guardano anche al non lavoro. Ed è a poco che i giuristi del lavoro studiano la previdenza sociale. Noi pensavamo fosse una cosa da economisti o da sociologi, quindi ovviamente meno importante. E pensavamo solo alle regole del rapporto. Oggi invece studiamo le regole anche del mercato e anche di chi il lavoro non ce l'ha o di chi ha, peggio che non avere un lavoro, ha un paralavoro, una specie di rapporto di lavoro, che sono tutti quei rapporti che il professor Standing ci ha descritto, che è lavorare male, occupare il proprio tempo per cercare di mettere insieme un reddito sufficiente. Allora, quel diritto del lavoro come diritto di protezione serve a regolare un mondo feroce, un mondo che è sempre stato poco solidale, soprattutto è stato poco solidale con i giovani, che sono sempre stati poco apprezzati nel mercato del lavoro, sempre stati sfruttati, che però vedevano nella loro maturazione dell'età la possibilità di arrivare a un posto migliore, al posto degli altri. Ed è anche un mercato del lavoro che per lungo tempo si è disinteressato degli anziani. Perché? Perché gli anziani non c'erano. I matrimoni duravano una vita quando la vita durava 40 anni, le pensioni a 65 anni andavano benissimo, e lo scrive il professor Standing, quando l'età media era 62. Allora, se mettiamo insieme la demografia, cioè come è cambiata la società, meno giovani che entrano e danno il loro apporto gratis o per poco più, e più anziani sul groppone da mantenere con le giovani generazioni, più ci rendiamo conto che il modello di diritto del lavoro che c'è oggi è insostenibile. Insostenibile perché è annacquare, togliere i vecchi diritti di un mondo e di un mercato del lavoro che non esistono più. Cerco di spiegarmi meglio, mi spiace per le spalle, per i gironzoli, però cerco di partire con un esempio chiaro, l'esempio che si porta sempre all'articolo 18, che tutti conosciamo per essere la regola che dal 1970 ha protetto i lavoratori, la maggior parte dei lavoratori del mercato del lavoro italiano, se guardiamo i numeri, contro i licenziamenti ingiustificati. E come li ha protetti? Li ha protetti in un modo molto forte, dando loro la garanzia di ritornare nel posto di lavoro una volta che il licenziamento intimato dal datore fosse stato riconosciuto non buono, unfair, non valido. Dobbiamo ancora discutere l'articolo 18 di fronte a 100 milioni di voucher venduti. Stiamo parlando di cose che non comunicano. Il mercato del lavoro che abbiamo conosciuto e che abbiamo regolato nel 1970 oggi non esiste. Allora, la prima idea è: tolgo un po' di diritti perché ridistribuisco i sacrifici, perché stiamo peggio tutti e quindi stiamo più uniti, ci vogliamo più bene, perché insomma nel male le famiglie si uniscono. Non voglio parlare di famiglie, scusate, non ho voluto, mi è scappato, non lo farò più. Nel male le persone singole si uniscono con i loro diritti individuali ma dove? Ma in quale mondo? Noi stiamo facendo la lotta dei giovani contro i pensionati, dei posti fissi contro i precari, dei privati contro gli statali. Non più tardi di 2 settimane fa ho intavolato una ferocissima discussione con mia madre, insegnante, quindi lavoro pubblico, pensionata a 55 anni, accusandola di aver rubato nelle tasche dei giovani, quando lei mi diceva: ma io non sono rimasta a casa, mi sono occupata di mia madre che aveva 90 anni. Work and labor. Se avessimo contato il PIL della badante della nonna, le cose sarebbero andate bene, ma la badante, la nonna, era mia mamma e quindi le cose sono andate male. Abbiamo un pensionato in più e meno reddito ridistribuito. Allora, cerco un po' di chiudere questo intervento, così iniziamo a mettere le cose in tavola. Se pensiamo di togliere diritti al vecchio mercato del lavoro e alle vecchie regole del lavoro per regolamentare il mercato nuovo, abbiamo sbagliato tutto, perché non ci sarà più sicurezza, ci sarà meno sicurezza. Non ci saranno più garanzie, ci saranno meno garanzie. Non ci sarà nessun circolo virtuoso, non partirà una spirale di nuovo lavoro togliendo le hanno chiamate le incrostazioni del mercato del lavoro. O qui si pensa in un altro modo, oppure faremo i conti con quello che abbiamo sentito benissimo, su cui io, che sociologa non sono, non mi permetto di dilungarmi. Ma la giuslavorista, la studiosa di diritto del lavoro che c'è in me, dice: non voglio più parlare dell'articolo 18. Voglio parlare dei lavoratori a voucher, voglio parlare dei lavoratori somministrati, voglio parlare di quella parte del mercato del lavoro che è l'unica che si muove. E non sono le posizioni top della classifica, ma sono neanche la serie B.
Puoi spiegarci un attimo questa cosa dei 100 milioni di voucher che molti avranno chiara ma non tutti? Cioè che cosa significa in termini di... Che cosa significa in termini di cambiamento del mercato? Cioè, cosa c'è dietro quei 100 milioni di voucher?
Qualche giorno fa abbiamo presentato i risultati di un progetto di ricerca nazionale di interesse finanziato dal Ministero, questi grandi progetti che ogni tanto il Ministero ci permette di fare, Ministero dell'Istruzione, Università e Ricerca, e la nostra unità di lavoro di Udine, che è composta da studiosi di diritto del lavoro, ma anche studiosi di diritto del lavoro che vengono dalla facoltà di economia, ed è per quello che iniziamo a ragionare di altre cose, e noi ci siamo focalizzati abbiamo studiato i contratti cosiddetti non standard, il contratto di lavoro con l'agenzia di somministrazione, i voucher, il contratto a termine, il contratto di lavoro a tempo parziale. Abbiamo cercato di capire se quel lavoro traghetta le persone dal lavoro nero illegale, se quei contratti portano dal lavoro nero illegale verso il buon lavoro, verso un mercato del lavoro di qualità. E in particolare il mio oggetto di studio sono stati i voucher. un po' perché dal 2008 la nostra regione è stata la prima a sperimentarli. Non serve nemmeno che parliamo di che cosa sono i voucher, perché lo sappiamo tutti. Si va in edicola, si compra un buono di un'ora, si prende il lavoratore per un'ora, poi magari lo si fa lavorare anche 3, 4, 8, questo è un altro discorso e lo vediamo magari dopo, ma io compro un'ora di lavoro. Non ho nessun rapporto con te, non abbiamo un contratto di lavoro, non c'è nessuna formalizzazione, è la società liquida e anche il lavoro liquido. Quello che noi abbiamo visto è che il mercato del lavoro sta traghettando le vecchie posizioni standard e non dal nero verso il mercato del lavoro regolare, ma al contrario, dal mercato del lavoro regolare verso le posizioni non standard e in particolare verso i voucher, che per come sono oggi permettono qualsiasi tipo di abuso. Permettono il lavoro nero, ma legalizzato. Permettono di emarginare i lavoratori ancora di più perché il lavoratore che lavora con i voucher non ci pensa nemmeno al sindacato. Il sindacato non capisce queste forme di lavoro perché non sono lavoro, sono solo prestazioni occasionali. Il lavoratore per voucher o la lavoratrice per voucher non pensa a un progetto di vita. Non ha un'indennità di maternità di nessun tipo, non ha un congedo parentale. Quando io leggo nella recentissima disciplina di diritto del lavoro, i decreti del 2015 che ci hanno tanto occupato a scrivere commenti, leggo la grande novità dei congedi parentali a ore, leggo che si può usufruire del tempo parziale, però l'idea è sempre che c'è una lavoratrice subordinata inserita in un'impresa che gode di diritti. Non è una persona che lavora per voucher a 300 euro al mese, perché per quella persona non è previsto nulla. Quella persona non gode del sussidio di disoccupazione, perché lavora per voucher. Non gode dell'indennità di maternità, non gode di ferie, non gode di permessi, di riposi, di sabati, di domeniche, è completamente e sempre a disposizione. Io credo che la parola di cui dobbiamo riappropriarci è il tempo. Dividere il tempo del labor, del lavoro salariato e qualificarlo esattamente. Perché un lavoratore precario oggi, e passatemi, è molto brutto dire un lavoratore precario, dovremmo dire un precario e basta, perché non è un lavoratore precario, è un precario di vita. Allora, quella persona oggi che ha un'instabilità così estesa non ha il proprio tempo e dobbiamo discutere dell'articolo 18, dobbiamo discutere dei congedi parentali con queste persone. Stiamo parlando lingue diverse e il caso dei voucher, su cui il governo ha già promesso una revisione, sono usciti 3 articoli di fila sul Sole 24 Ore che insomma su questi temi non porta proprio la voce del popolo, porta una voce ben specifica. Sono usciti 3 giornate di fila. Attenzione ai voucher, i voucher sono tanti, i voucher sono colpa della Fornero, il che vuol dire che ci metteremo mano, perché se sono colpa di qualcun altro stiamo per lavorarci sopra e a giugno avremo i dati per poter mettere un meccanismo di controllo maggiore, però per giugno si vedrà.
Grazie. Allora, mi sembra che abbiamo visto la traduzione locale di un fenomeno globale, quindi diciamo il racconto del mercato del lavoro italiano conferma l'analisi generale di Guy Standing. Io ne approfitterei subito per aprire un po' di dibattito e intanto che voi pensate alla vostra domanda faccio io la prima a Guy Standing. I will open the floor to question, but I will take the opportunity to have the first one. My question is somewhere related to what you said about trade unions, that they don't understand what's going on, they don't understand what they were supposed to do to protect the bottom of the pyramid, the social pyramid. So my question is about the traditional left parties. Why they cannot understand that they need a new progressive agenda to reach the same objective that they tried to reach the past, and now they need to just to find a different way to protect the poor people who are not the same poor that in the 90s or in the 80s or in the 50s, but they are different people, so they need to find a different agenda. Why they are not changing? Because they are losing votes, so they should fear the pressure from failure, because they are losing. Yeah, first question, and then e voi pensate e poi tocca a voi.
I have a whole chapter in the new book trying to answer this question. I think the major reason why the old Social Democrat parties, the old Labour parties, cannot reach the precariat is that they are founded on the values of labourism, by which I mean that in the 20th century they fought to make labour have rights. It's a contradiction in terms, because a right should be universal, but it only actually applies that if you do labour, then you should have entitlements. If you do labour, then you should get certain privileges. And I think they find it impossible to move away from that model of thinking. And I've been having debates with various leaders of social democrat parties and Labour parties since the book was published, the first book was published. And they all have this difficulty. And one leader, a major leader of a big party, I won't say who, but I spent a weekend with him talking, and he said, Guy, I believe what you're saying. I just can't say it.
Why not?
Exactly. Because he said, if I say it, I will be out. I'll be thrown out by the union people, by the old representatives of labourism. And I said, well, you shouldn't be leader. You should go somewhere else. And we're at a very interesting point where we're going to see, I think, some realignments of political on the left. Because everywhere the old Social Democrats have lost and are losing, and they are trying to do just as Renzi. Renzi is like Tony Blair was when he started. You know, you make tax cuts. Who gets the benefits of tax cuts? You have spending cuts. Who pays for those spending cuts? So you gradually lose your constituency. You gradually lose your own base by trying to be utilitarian, appealing to your concept of the middle class. But the Labour and Social Democrat parties are not succeeding. They won't succeed. And that is bad and good, but because it is opening up this opportunity for a new progressive politics. But until we get away from labourism, we will not see a break.
So we need to hope that the traditional left will disappear as soon as possible.
No, fragment into different things, and it's happening. Look what's happening in Spain with the Podemos. Look what's happening in Poland. Look what's happening in Denmark, where you've got a precariat party that has come into existence. You know, with Syriza, look what happened to PASOK, killed. Then, of course, Tsipras failed everybody, but you've had a break. You have a new possibilities.
Molto chiaro. Cominciare a raccogliere le domande, solite regole, brevi, così abbiamo tempo per tutti e sfruttiamo bene l'opportunità.
Sì. Ok, penso anch'io che la sinistra e il sindacato, io sono un sindacalista, siano prigionieri delle proprie conquiste, nel senso che tutti i diritti che abbiamo creato derivano dal lavoro. In particolare in Italia però i diritti non derivano dal lavoro, derivano dal posto di lavoro che ho, se lavoro nella grande azienda, se lavoro nel pubblico impiego, per cui ci sono rendite che derivano da posizionamenti in questa azienda o in quell'altro luogo di lavoro. Tant'è che l'articolo 18 ha garantito una parte minima dei lavoratori italiani, e c'è perché le aziende in Italia sono quasi tutte sotto i 9 dipendenti, vedete voi, e invece l'articolo 18 tutela soltanto le aziende che hanno almeno 16 dipendenti, per cui aveva questa parzialità voluta dal legislatore, ma ce l'aveva. Il tema è questo nuovo proletariato però che non ha il senso e la consapevolezza di sé, ma è scolarizzato, a volte anche acculturato. Come rappresentarlo? Perché è molto mobile. Io penso, e la domanda è questa, che una cosa che il sindacato debba mettere in campo è una serie di servizi alla persona, non soltanto al lavoratore, alla persona tutto tondo, per accompagnarlo non soltanto nel mercato del lavoro, ma proprio complessivamente con servizi. Ad esempio, se uno in Italia è una partita IVA, lavoratore autonomo, io credo che noi possiamo dargli il servizio di tenergli la contabilità senza che vada a farsi spennare da un commercialista, per parlare chiaro, e anche altri servizi. C'è un perché il sindacato è stato disattento, e anche la sinistra, a questi lavoratori, a queste persone. Non tutti, ma la maggioranza sono giovani. I giovani non sono numerosi, le elezioni per la politica si vincono con il voto di quelli che hanno i capelli bianchi come me, e il sindacato gli iscritti ha nelle grandi aziende, nel pubblico impiego, per cui sono poco interessanti in quanto non sono iscritti. Questo è un errore esiziale se continua a essere così per il sindacato.
Grazie, c'era... You want to...
Because he's made it.
Okay, so, Guy wants to answer.
I don't know if I fully understood all your points, but I'd like to respond to the general idea of the trade unions. And I think I've always been a member of a trade union, okay? But I'm critical of trade unions. And I was asked to address a summer school of trade union leaders from across Europe. And I was talking about the precariat, and I could see all the old union leaders, they were just not interested. They were not interested, okay? And then I got to the point, I said, why is it that wherever I go in the world, if I start talking about basic income, the most hostile reactions come from trade union leaders? The most hostile reaction. And I said, why? Because you think we're talking about redistributing income, giving people security and things. So you shouldn't be hostile. You might have, doubts, but hostility? Strange. So at that point, the chair, who was a very old senior trade union leader, said, okay, we'll break for coffee now. So I'd asked the question, no answer. Break for coffee. So we went for coffee, and when we came back, he stood up and he said, all right, we will move to the next subject now. And as it happened, a young trade union, you know what trade union leaders are, they're all ancient, but this one was in his 40s. Young Italian trade union leader, I will not say his name, but I know him well now, stood up and he said, wait. I want to give an answer to Guy's question, because I think we should answer it. And the chair said, oh, okay. And he said, I think the reason is that if people had basic security, they wouldn't want to join trade unions. And everybody was nodding. And I said to him, I said, if you think about that for 1 second, you would think how disgraceful and amoral that is. Because you're saying that if people have security, they wouldn't join unions. But actually, I said, psychologically, that is wrong, too. Because people who have basic security are more likely to indulge in collective action, more likely to join bodies, because they have a greater degree of confidence and a greater degree of a sense of themselves. It's wrong. But the fact is that unions have been hostile to movements to free people. And that is the problem. And they don't understand the precariat, and they don't understand the agenda of the precariat. But I still remain a union member because we need collective bodies. But we need them to be transformed.
Just your opinion about one interesting point that our friend touched. He said that trade unions should offer services not to the workers, but to the person. So they should help him like with bills, like with the bureaucracy, and not only with his
I think
company.
I understood that point. I think that in my proposals, 5 of the Charter articles about how unions could change their character, and one of them is to move towards social movements, and the second is to realize that instead of just collective bargaining between labor and capital, there should be more collaborative bargaining between different occupational groups. If you talk to a nurse, for example, who is the most exploitative person for a nurse? It's the doctor, not necessarily the employer. It's the same with a whole lot of professions. So unions have to change in that respect. But I also think that unions have to realize that they have to become part of a changing political strategy, which is spending more priorities on the sort of issues that I talk about in the books: recruitment practices, access to social benefits, changing the rental structure of capitalism. And if for that, they've got to change their character so fundamentally that one wonders if they can do it.
Anna, ti chiedo solo prima di andare avanti con le domande di dirci come la vedi sul lato italiano, cioè in Italia un po' di dibattito c'è sul reddito minimo, il reddito di cittadinanza, eccetera. Anche qui i sindacati non sembrano esattamente entusiasti di queste idee.
Le suggestioni del professor Stenni si possono riportare uguali in Italia. Quando si parla con la politica si divide fra chi è favorevole al salario minimo a prescindere, comunque esso sia e qualunque esso sia, e chi è contrario a prescindere perché sarebbero nuove forme per evitare di far entrare le persone nel normale mercato del lavoro. Quanto al sindacato, il sindacato è molto lontano dall'idea del salario minimo, e la suggestione è proprio, e questo io lo ritrovo parlando con i sindacalisti, la suggestione è proprio che si crede che il lavoratore che la persona debba trovare tutela nel sindacato in quanto lavoratore, non in quanto persona. La persona deve trovare un riscontro nella politica, non nel sindacato. Questo è un po' il ragionamento che viene fatto. E quando il sindacato dice noi vogliamo offrire servizi, ed è un discorso che io ho sentito fare molte volte, forse il vero servizio che il sindacato dovrebbe offrire è essere sindacato, cioè rappresentare. Perché io il commercialista ce l'ho e neanche non mi spenna, perché per me fa un buon lavoro. Però il punto è, il sindacato è necessario oggi molto più di 10 anni fa. Perché 10 anni fa c'era la legge a tutelare i lavoratori, c'era il contratto a tutelare i lavoratori. Oggi, con la frammentazione che c'è, con l'impossibilità di mettere insieme in un mese una serie di lavori coerenti, il sindacato può fare tantissimo. Allora, viva il sindacato, che vive però, non il sindacato che si ricorda di com'era.
Andiamo avanti, siamo approntate un po' di persone, cerchiamo di farne 2 o 3, così facciamo un
Sì,
giro.
sulla vischiosità del passato la dice lunga il fatto che il primo articolo della nostra Costituzione dice che l'Italia è uno Stato fondato sul lavoro. Quindi questa vischiosità non è soltanto dei partiti, dei sindacati, ma proprio della forma, no, dello Stato. Questo è molto, molto eloquente.
Ok,
A parte questo...
se parla più lentamente così
Ah,
anche
sì, giusto,
il
mi
professore
scusi. Giusto.
riesce a seguire un po'.
Giusto.
He was saying that the first article of our constitution said that Italy is founded on labor, so it's
On work.
on work, sorry, on work, sorry.
E io vorrei portare la discussione dalla domanda che verge sul problema, sulla difficoltà degli organismi tradizionali a rappresentare esigenze nuove, invece vorrei riportarla sul problema che verge sulla difficoltà estrema che invece hanno le persone, i precari, a porre i loro temi, quindi appunto l'inverso. Questa forse è una delle uniche generazioni, la mia intendo, che non si è affacciata alla storia e non ha posto il proprio tema in maniera collettiva. L'hanno fatto i nostri genitori col 68, e la classe dirigente più giovane nell'Europa del 40 era la classe dirigente nazista, quella fascista. Prima ancora le piazze durante la prima guerra mondiale erano piene di giovani interventisti, e prima ancora i partiti socialisti erano abitati da una nuova generazione che si voleva affacciare alla storia e collettivamente voleva porre i propri temi. Prima ancora c'è stata i 1000 che hanno fatto l'Italia, il risorgimento, erano ragazzi, giovani. Il 48, la rivoluzione francese, cioè tutta la storia contemporanea è stata basata sull'attivismo di un gruppo, di una nuova generazione che si è posta nella storia, che ha fatto errori disgraziati oppure grandissimi progressi, ma in tutti i casi questa classe di giovani ha voluto porre i propri temi. Questo non manca più, certo i sindacati, la politica non riesce più, ma è una generazione che a mio parere non riesce a porre i propri temi. Quindi, domanda. A me sembra che più di una classe esplosiva si possa parlare di una classe potenzialmente esplosiva, che è molto diverso in senso aristotelico. La classe esplosiva è qualcosa che è effettivamente esplode.
Chiaro.
Quello che è potenzialmente esplosivo invece è qualcosa che cova. Qual è, dal punto di vista scientifico, proprio secondo lei, la causa di questo? Cioè, perché la rabbia non si organizza, non si esprime in forme organizzate, ma rimane ancora troppo spesso gestita individualmente?
Grazie. Prendiamone altre 2, una e poi c'è Emanuele.
I'll do the question in English. Well, thanks for your talk, Guy. It was an outstanding talk, and I'd like to draw a connection with the next panel that is going to focus on the political aspect of bringing about new economic and social models. And so I wanted to ask you about the new social movements and parties that you mentioned before that fund their politics on the precariat, or fund part of the politics on this new social sector. And I'd like to know in particular how their politics has been, how it has fared so far, which are the perspectives for them, and which other social sectors they should ideally look at in order to build a broader coalition of forces to bring a substantial challenge to power. And then I want to focus on something that he also mentioned, although in some other, in a different way. And when you say the precariat, the first phase of the recognition of the precariat is the mirror phase, right? And that reminds a lot of Althusser. It's a mirror phase in which the precariat looks at itself in a mirror and recognizes that he's not alone. He's not a humble, miserable human being, but there are thousands of people like him around himself. But how does this phase come about? I mean, it seems to me that the trade union phase, the corporative phase in which one doesn't yet reason politically, but at least recognizes his or her own, more material economic interests, it's very difficult to come about in the traditional sense. Firstly, because, precariat workers are scattered. It is about the very logistics of their work that makes it very difficult for them to coalesce in a unique subject. And secondly, because if we still hope that the trade union will give them voice, well, I think there will be an entirely hopeless ambition, really. And so, how about their recognition, their feeling of themselves as an economic and political actor will come about already in the political sphere, bypassing entirely the trade union phase?
Ok, Emanuele aspetta il giro dopo. Ok.
Okay, let me just respond to that just as I understood it and your points. I think one of the most important little things that we need to do is actually the article number 1 of the Charter. A lot of people have asked me, why did you make this the number 1? And the number 1 in the Charter is that we need to reconceptualize work. It sounds very, small or unimportant. But to reconceptualize what it is we mean by work and redefine work then leads to a demand for statistical changes. Now, those are the sort of changes which seem very parochial and very small, but they start opening up the imagination because they actually would show the vast amount of work that people do that doesn't get counted as work. And that is part of the looking in the mirror. And the quotation that I've got in the book, the second book, which I carry around with me all the time, was a piece of graffiti that I saw on a Madrid wall from the Indignados. And basically it said, the worst thing would be to return to the old normal. It's a sense of we don't want to go back to that laborist period. And I think that the feeling of being scattered that you talk about is not just the weakness of feeling that we don't have a collective, the Novecento type of collective that you go forward en masse, but the interconnectedness that is developing in the precariat. I get thousands of emails from people all over the world who are connecting with each other and are forming movements. Now, just to give one example, in the Polish election recently, which was a disaster, just before the election, some parts of the precariat, happened to be in Poland, they asked to see me and they'd formed a political movement called Razem. So Razem, together. It's a precariat movement. I met all the leaders. The only problem is they didn't have a leader. This is the first phase. They didn't have a leader. But they stood in the election. And they got 700,000 votes without any money, without any leaders. 700,000 votes. They got 3.6% of the total vote. And as a result of that, they now have funding for the next 5 years so they can build the structures and things. The same with Podemos. Podemos formed in a few weeks and became a political movement. We may be disappointed in some respects, but the fact is that it's become a movement very quickly and it's just won 79 seats in the Spanish election. And we're seeing a lot of things, the same with the Alternative in Denmark. It's from nothing. It's got 10% and it's growing, all the time. I'm going there next week and I'm addressing the movements, but there is the potential there. And this sense of recognition is already getting politically re-engaged. And what we have a real challenge, which you may address this afternoon, is the following, that there has been political disengagement. A leading European politician recently wrote to me and said, the precariat is post-political. And I wrote back very angrily and said, no, it just doesn't belong to your party. It's looking for alternatives. But there's an energy out there which is extraordinary. And we should not be disappointed at this stage because things are developing remarkably quickly by historical standards. Remarkably quickly. So I think that looking in the mirror, and Pierre Bourdieu's famous statement about the precariat not being able to mobilize, I think that's past. I think there is huge energy that's mobilized.
Solo un punto, abbiamo parlato di statistiche, in Italia siamo reduci da diciamo, un paio d'anni in cui le statistiche sono diventate più o meno una cosa quotidiana sui titoli di giornali, in televisione, non era mai successo prima, ci sono numeri sul lavoro ogni 2 settimane praticamente, c'è l'Istat, l'Inps, il Ministero del Lavoro, qualunque cosa è buona per farci titolo, la CGA di Mestre, qua siamo quasi in zona, una delle grandi iatture del paese dal punto di vista della confusione statistica. Anna Tilly, cosa sta succedendo? Cioè, davvero, come dice Guy Standing, è da lì che bisogna partire per cambiare, oppure può essere semplicemente un modo, se si fa, come io temo, in maniera un po' disinvolta, per nascondere i problemi, si fanno emergere lavoratori statisticamente e si dice che è migliorato il quadro economico.
Mettere insieme le statistiche e l'economia è vicenda complicatissima, perché l'economia è fatta di persone vere, che vivono, mangiano, dormono, si muovono. Le statistiche si possono costruire per quello che si vuole dire. L'esempio che porto sempre agli studenti è che cos'è un disoccupato. La nozione di disoccupato è diversa da paese a paese, non c'è una nozione standard. In Italia chi ha un reddito annuale inferiore a 8.000 euro è un disoccupato. In Germania è occupato chi lavora 1 ora a settimana stabilmente. Allora, mettiamo insieme le cose. Vogliamo parlare di lavoro e non lavoro? Di labor e non labor? Vogliamo parlare di come una persona si ritiene occupata? Parliamo di altre cose. Ma allora lasciamo stare le statistiche sull'occupazione, la disoccupazione, perché basta cambiare di poco la nozione di lavoratore. Basta dire che chiunque abbia un'occupazione, che lo tiene impegnato, è un lavoratore o è comunque un soggetto attivo nel mercato del lavoro e includiamo subito 3-4 milioni di donne che oggi non producono PIL formalmente, ma sono a casa a curarsi di bambini o di anziani. 3-4 milioni di persone. Poi pensiamo a 500.000 persone stabilmente attive nel sociale, che fanno solidarietà sociale, ma per le statistiche non valgono nulla. Non è reddito del paese questo? Allora, ha ragione Guy Standing quando dice i dati si scrivono, le statistiche vanno cambiate e dobbiamo considerare tutto quello che è fare insieme, fare sociale, fare non solo produrre PIL.
Emanuele Ferragina.
So first of all, thanks a lot, Guy Standing, not only for your wonderful talk, but if you might know, like tomorrow we will discuss the main words of the forum, and you gave us 3/4 of them. So thanks a lot for that. Just one thing, and then I'll come quickly to a question. I was just looking at data on the share of votes of different group of age and different type of occupations in the Americans' recent Iowa primary election, and it seems this data is still not perfect, but they're quite overwhelming. So even if they move by 5 or 6%, it will not change. It seems that Bernie Sanders, which is the only candidate in the Democratic primary election which stands as a socialist, got 84% of the vote of people below age 30, and 58% of people who are between age 30 and 45. He got, of course, an overwhelming majority of votes from people with low income and people who didn't participate in previous elections of the Democratic Party. if we add that up to what happened with Corbyn in the United Kingdom quite recently, and then we added up with what happened in Italy in 2013, where 52% of precarious workers voted for the Five-Star Movement. Besides what we think about them, like just 52% of precarious workers voted for them. We can multiply with Podemos, your example of Poland, Portugal, whatever. So the mirror phase, it's happening. But my question then is, do we really believe that these people who are starting to recognize themselves, they might find a way of being recognized in the system and get to change through the compromise route, which is the one, the Social Democratic Party have been proposing for a long time, and in a sense, the New Labour was trying to tell us, hey people, it's not time anymore for social conflict. Like, we have tools to make efficient politics to make everything better. So my question is, Guy, don't you think that the only real thing that is still missing in the equation, it's a good share of conflict? And I know, people don't like to use this word, but maybe only through conflict, new generation who are deprived into the, belonging of wealth, income, can take some share of what they deserve because they're full members of a society.
C'è altre domande? Rispondiamo subito. Prendiamo la seconda e...
Hello, I'll ask my question in English too. Basically, I wanted to develop on the idea of work. I think the first article of the Constitution refers to work as in activity, not really labor, since the Constitution was written in 46 and Italy was in tatters. So the idea was, I see it this way, that unless we do something, there won't be in Italy. So developing on the idea of work, I think a lot of what is needed, a lot of green work, a lot of work that is socially desirable, occurs spontaneously within people's houses. If you think about recycling, for example, there's no benefit, there's no incentive in Italy to recycle, and yet millions of people have just taken to doing it, even though it's, it's an extra burden on whatever someone has to do during the day. So couldn't a way forward, together with the basic minimum wage, which, as I understand, is money for nothing, insomma, in other words, and not unemployment benefit, couldn't a way of helping that, couldn't that be to limit labor as opposed to work? So to reduce the working week, to give more people, more time to do things that are genuinely useful and desirable, and also at the same time to do like De Beers does with the diamonds, or as the oil producers do with the oil, to make work artificially more scarce and therefore more valuable.
Yes. Let me answer both those things. I think the interesting thing about the populists on the left is that it's remarkable that they're being represented by aged men when they are attracting the young precariat, Bernie Sanders, Jeremy Corbyn, who actually represent old laborist values, actually. But they're mobilizing, and I think the reason is that we are still at the primitive rebels phase. The primitive rebels, in the historical term, is a very useful term. It implies we know what we are against, but we don't necessarily know what we're for. Okay? It's the Robin Hood phase. We're against that. And that is mobilizing at the moment for these aged politicians who are having the courage, at least, to stand up, But I think that this room for compromise, you mentioned the word compromise, the room for that, for being bought off and being absorbed back into sort of some social democracy, right, is much more limited than it used to be. Because the structural inequalities and insecurities are much deeper than it can be dealt with with the old social democratic strategies. We are at a genuine crisis where the inequality and the insecurities are chronic. And the old laborist sort of agenda doesn't touch it. That's why that graffiti was so wonderful, because it's not able to make those compromises. So very quickly, the Jeremy Corbyns, I got an email from Noam Chomsky, of all people, and Noam Chomsky said, "What do you think, Guy, of Jeremy Corbyn?" So I wrote back to him saying, "Look, I am not religious, but if I were religious, I would say he's closer to John the Baptist than to Jesus Christ." And what these people are doing is basically they are mold breakers. Jeremy Corbyn has killed New Labour. Fantastic. It's a great achievement. New Labour is unelectable now. Okay? And you will, some stage, somebody will kill the Italian version that Renzi represents. You know, they'll reach their end. No, I agree, but I think we're at such a fertile phase, and Podemos is having this struggle at the moment. Should it go too respectable, or should it hold to thing? And I get a lot of invitations to Spain at the moment because there's a real debate going on. It's very interesting.
And what's your opinion about this debate in Spain?
I think that
should
it's
they
going to
do?
have to go through several phases. That's why the Catalonian parties and the energies in and around Barcelona are fantastic, because they are much more consistent with the precariat agendas. A lot of interesting things developing. But to come to your points, I liked your introduction, but it's been extra complicated now because of the technological revolution. I mean, the development of robotics and all the electronic developments and the rentier labor brokers that are developing are having a huge effect on income inequality. So technology is becoming part of the process and is generating demands for a lot more work that is not labor. The term that's being used, and you'll see a lot more of it in the future, and I hope the chapter in my new book deals with it, is heteromation. The technological changes are generating demand for a lot more work that doesn't get remunerated or measured in the system. But I want to correct for one thing. The basic income is not a basic wage, all right? And you can justify it philosophically. Very important to justify it philosophically as to say the following, that the wealth and income of any of us in this room or any of these other people is far more due to the contributions of our ancestors than anything we do ourselves, obviously, right? And we don't know whose ancestors contributed to our individual and collective wealth. And in a sense, you can see a basic income as a social dividend on the collected efforts and wealth of our forebears. It isn't something for nothing. It is something, a return for the investments of our societies in the collective wealth. And we shouldn't see it as something for nothing as the right would like us to be depicting it. It is a sense of giving us a return to our collective wealth.
So without conditionality.
Without conditionality, as a legal resident of Udine, legal resident of Manchester or wherever, as a citizen resident in your country. And if someone is a legal migrant, they would have access to it. But I think you are, when you say limiting labor, reducing working time, that's a laborist response. It would work if everybody was in a factory working 8 hours a day or whatever it is. The reality is, in a flexible, insecure system, is you can't control working time like that. The only way you can control working time is if I can say no. Because otherwise, you have to do whatever you have to do. Shortening the working week, as some people have said to me and I quoted in the book, if you shorten my working week, I will have to spend more time working unpaid. So that it's not a solution. And I think way of putting it, if there are any Marxists in the room, is the following. The laborist response of the socialists and social democrats of the 20th century was the decommodification of labor. Lenin, for example, saw the withering away of the wage, okay? And the decommodification of labor meant there were no incentives to take labor, and the labor power, the person, was commodified. The 21st century should reverse that, okay? Commodify labor fully. Let us have a bargain. You pay me what you can afford, I'll accept what I think is justifiable. As long as we have equal bargaining power, which is what the unions should stand for, let's have full commodification of labor, the activity. But decommodify ourselves. Decommodify labor power, us. And that is what a basic income is all about, really. Giving us the capability to bargain.
Ecco Anna, su questo c'è un punto importante, perché in Italia sembra esserci ormai un consenso abbastanza diffuso sul fatto che ci possa essere un reddito universale, chiamiamolo come vogliamo, però condizionato alla ricerca del lavoro, tanto che perfino il Movimento 5 Stelle, che è il partito che lo ha, diciamo, un po' imposto sull'agenda, lo lega in maniera magari non chiarissima, ma lo lega in maniera netta alla ricerca del lavoro, come un'assicurazione contro la disoccupazione più che un vero reddito di cittadinanza, cioè una specie di paracadute per quando le cose vanno male. Perché, ti chiedo, e se è giuridicamente percorribile un'alternativa, cioè di dire diamo a tutti 500 euro al mese, per com'è il diritto del lavoro italiano e il contesto italiano. Poi
Questa
magari...
regione ha sperimentato il reddito di cittadinanza circa 10 anni fa con... Come?
Vogliamo... Sì,
Allora, quella volta si
pagina...
chiamava di cittadinanza in questa regione, però è una questione... Allora, è chiaro, se vogliamo usare l'etichetta corretta, oggi sarebbe un reddito minimo.
Che lo spieghiamo, cittadinanza vuol dire che dipende, come un modello che guy standing, uno è cittadino italiano e ha diritto a un reddito minimo è tutto quello che invece è legato a un qualche tipo di parametro, quindi non dipende solo dall'essere cittadini. Poi appunto magari qui l'hanno chiamato di cittadinanza,
Allora,
ma nei fatti forse...
diciamo, quello fu un reddito di povertà, quindi per persone a forte rischio di esclusione sociale, e l'esperimento all'epoca funzionò bene, nel senso che attraverso questo reddito, questo sostegno, le persone vennero reincluse in un mercato del lavoro regolare, come era però 10 anni fa. Allora, a me sembra molto chiaro il discorso che viene fatto invece sul reddito di cittadinanza, e cioè la questione della condizionalità, che per i non addetti ai lavori è: ti do un sostegno, purché tu o accetti un'occasione di lavoro che io ti propongo, o un'occasione di formazione che io ti propongo, anche non vicina alle tue esperienze e competenze, e anche non vicina a casa tua, quindi che comporta per te un certo sacrificio. Beh, in Italia oggi la dea della condizionalità sembra avere molti adepti. È la nuova religione, la condizionalità. E nei giuristi del lavoro c'è un enorme consenso sulla condizionalità rispetto ad esempio all'assegno di disoccupazione. E questo perché? Perché nella patria dei furbetti si è sempre detto che i disoccupati che percepiscono l'assegno, o le persone che godono di una cassa integrazione, o le persone in qualche modo sospese ma che hanno un sussidio pubblico, in realtà lavorano in nero e sottraggono risorse al mercato regolare. Il discorso che si fa invece sul reddito di cittadinanza è completamente nuovo e diverso. Non stiamo parlando di sostegno per la ricerca di un lavoro, non stiamo parlando di hai perso un lavoro io ti aiuto, stiamo parlando della socializzazione della ricchezza intesa come un tuo diritto di cittadinanza. Allora le vie del diritto sono assolutamente percorribili. Il reddito di cittadinanza, come lo intendiamo oggi, nel nostro ordinamento è assolutamente compatibile. Non è uno strumento di diritto del lavoro e permetterebbe finalmente di superare quegli ostacoli terribili che ci sono per chi si trova in una condizione di bisogno. Facciamo un esempio molto semplice. Io perdo il lavoro oggi. A parte che come dipendente pubblico precario non avrò nulla, ma un dipendente del settore privato che perde il lavoro oggi godrà del suo primo giorno di indennità di disoccupazione se l'ufficio del lavoro, il centro per l'impiego e l'INPS sono particolarmente solerti, fra 60-90 giorni. Una persona in cassa integrazione, cioè sospesa dal lavoro, avrà il suo primo sussidio fra 3, 4, 5 mesi. Se va bene, se le carte sono fatte bene e se il sindacato è stato preciso e se il ministeriale è bravo, se tutti hanno fatto...
Questo non è colpa del sindacato.
No, se tutti hanno fatto le carte bene, no? Mettiamola così la vicenda. Allora, in questo senso, il reddito di cittadinanza permette di eliminare tutta una serie di sussidi pubblici, tutto questo legame che c'è fra chiedere e ottenere sussidi mirati verso uno strumento che libera la persona, che lo usa il reddito di cittadinanza verso le direzioni che intende prendere, studiare, lavorare, vivere.
Un'ultima replica, poi chiudiamo. 2 repliche. O commenti o domande, insomma. Domande. Proprio 2 rapide che abbiamo 5 minuti.
Salve, grazie. Una domanda per Anna e una per Guy. Per Anna è sul mercato del lavoro dal punto di vista legale. Cioè, abbiamo assistito per tutti gli anni 90 a una frammentazione del mercato del lavoro creando una giungla contrattuale, e quindi diversi tipi di contratti precari. E andiamo più piano, e dall'altro lato avevamo un lavoro formale. Quando si iniziava a parlare di contratto a tutele crescenti si pensava ok, questo sostituirà quella giungla e poi avremo il resto, invece ha tenuto la giungla e è andato a sostituire il contratto formale. Quindi qual è il punto del dibattito tra voi giuristi su come ridurre questa giungla di contratti? Perché la mia impressione, nel caso il nuovo contratto chiamato indeterminato non funzionasse per garantire una serie di diritti, c'è rimasta sempre la vecchia giungla alla quale si può tornare. The question for standing instead is about translation. So I am a very lucky owner of a lottery ticket, and I know that very well. And I try to communicate with other people, with other section of the precariat, as you understood, as you understand the phenomenon. But the problem is when I go and talk, and because I want to organize them, when I go and talk with migrants, they tell me, oh, you're Italian, you're an insider. We are different. So you are not the same. When I go to talk with someone from a deprived area, he's going to tell me, you are not from this territory, you cannot understand me. When I go to talk with someone that has a normal, low-skilled job, he tells me, you're an educated person, we don't talk the same language. So I do understand that we have in common the interest, for example, for basic income, but there is an issue of translations. I understand in somehow the precariat, it seems to me to work as a class discourse, but there are different relations of production between me and the other elements of it. And this is a huge challenge in order to progress. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I'll be very short. I wanted you to elaborate possibly on examples like you've done for movements of the precariat around the world, on the statistical side of labeling work versus labor. Are there examples of movements in that direction? Because I'm figuring if the economical system, which is governing the rest of the systems at the moment, if that system only measures labor as we know it right now, what are the odds of us beating that system, if that is the only measure. So if there are good examples, maybe we can draw from those also to our movements or our attempts of pushing those. That is the only way I think we could then reimagine the work, everything that is to do, because maybe there is, in Italian it's very curious that a place of work, un posto di lavoro, no, you look for a place of work and not for work to be done. Thank you.
Grazie. Allora Anna e poi lasciamo la conclusione a Guy.
Sulla giungla dei contratti di lavoro, allora mi sembra che si dicesse un paio di anni fa che noi abbiamo 47 o 48 tipi contrattuali. E sì, è vero, le leggi degli ultimi anni hanno creato tanti nomi di contratto e quello che oggi chiamiamo il contratto a tutele crescenti in realtà sta conoscendo, ed è un contratto a tempo indeterminato, sta conoscendo un grande successo fondamentalmente perché non costa. Oggi il contratto a tutele crescenti si accompagna al fatto che non si pagano i contributi. Vediamo fra 2 anni, quando la sperimentazione sarà finita e si inizieranno a pagare i contributi sui nuovi assunti, vediamo appunto quella volta che fine farà il contratto a tutele crescenti. Opzione 1, niente più contratto a tutele crescenti e si torna ai vecchi contratti. No, perché comunque il contratto a tutele crescenti è la nuova forma comune dei contratti di lavoro. Ci si orienterà, come sempre, in base al cosiddetto assetto delle convenienze. Qual è il contratto che costa meno? Prima del contratto a tutele crescenti era il contratto a termine? Torneremo al contratto a termine. L'apprendistato? Andremo sull'apprendistato. Il mercato è molto più veloce dei giuristi nel riequilibrare gli assetti, ma io credo che magari fosse questo il problema da porsi, perché il problema è lavorare per app. Fra pochi anni avremo veramente una dematerializzazione completa dei rapporti di lavoro. Io oggi ho bisogno di una babysitter, vado sul sito provababysitter.com sperando che sia un babysitter e ottengo una persona che si è iscritta ed è stata vagliata dai gestori del sito a casa mia in 2 ore. E siamo a Udine, cioè ai confini dell'impero, dove la tecnologia è qualche passo indietro e dove i rapporti umani hanno ancora un certo peso. Allora, magari si tornasse fra 2 anni a parlare di contratti di lavoro. Io temo che l'apertura sia: oggi parliamo di tutele crescenti, fra 2 anni parleremo solo di prestazioni. Quindi parleremo di comprare un'ora di lavoro. Spero di sbagliarmi.
Molto chiaro, ma secondo me non ti sbagli. Guy Standing, very last sentence.
Let me just conclude. First of all, thank you all for listening to my English, as it were, this morning. And I'll respond to these things. First of all, on the statistical question again. Every transformation induces a revolution in statistical representations of reality. If you go to the 1930s, at the beginning of the 1930s, no country could measure their unemployment rate because the nature of the statistics was based on a 19th century view, main occupation. Didn't have the capacity. It took the Keynesian revolution in economics to need different forms of labor statistics. So the labor force approach developed in the 1930s in response to the crisis and the characteristics of the crisis. They needed to measure the unemployment rate. Today we are having a situation where the inequalities and insecurities cannot be answered by our conventional statistics. any of you are economists in the room, when for many years we had what's called the Phillips curve. There was a relationship between the rate of unemployment and wage or price changes. Nowadays, all the central banks, which still relate to the Phillips curve for their monetary policies, they're all scratching their heads because it doesn't work. And their statistics are useless because the Phillips curve is for a closed economy, an industrial society, and it doesn't work in it. So we're getting a lot of pressures for need for new types of statistics. And you asked specifically about other movements that look at different ways. Well, the basic income pilots that we did in India, I did it with SEWA, which is the Self-Employed Women's Association of India, the biggest union of women workers in the world. For many years, the trade union movements of the world refused to recognize SEWA. They refused to allow it into the International Labour Organization because they said it is not directly bargaining with employers. It is an organization, a social organization. Well, SEWA looks at all forms of work that women do, right? And it is transforming the perception of work by its very existence. And what we are seeing, I think, is in our society with aging, just that one thing, aging, we are seeing a greater and greater pressure on all of us to look after the elderly. This is work. And as that grows, and as the recognition that this is work we all could do or should do, it's going to transform the need. So I think that that's going to happen. The question about relating to different elements. My feeling on this one is that if you look back historically and the emergence of the proletariat, the vocabulary and the ability to get a unified perspective took decades, many, many years to crystallize. And if you look at that period, there was a lot of discordance. You can't be recognizing me. Craft workers couldn't work with other types of workers. We don't have the same language. We don't have the same imagery. But gradually that changes. And I think that is changing as we sit here. It is developing. And we need a new vocabulary. But that vocabulary is developing remarkably quickly, I believe. And I want to end by saying, look, I've just come from Maastricht, where we had a meeting on basic income on Sunday. And there were representatives of 19 cities and towns, local councils. And all of them are conducting and launching new pilots, experiments of different variants of moving towards a basic income. It's a period of experimentation that could lead in numerous directions. But 10 years ago, that wouldn't have been happening, right? And the final point I'd like to mention is this. Europe has just been having a huge social experiment called quantitative easing, QE. Every single month, Mr. Draghi, Mario Draghi, great Italian, who worked for Goldman Sachs for many years, more money. Just imagine if out of that 1,500 billion euros that's going to be spent by Mr. Draghi, part of that had been spent as a basic income for the poorest 10 regions of the European Union. The poorest 10, as a basic income for 2 years. Instead of quantitative easing, increasing inequality, having no effect on growth, and doing nothing except enrich the bankers, you would have stimulated growth in those low-income areas. You would have reduced European inequality dramatically, and you would have lowered out-migration from the poorest areas into Northern Europe, which is causing some of the political problems. Three good effects. Instead, they've given this basic income to bankers. It's that sort of possibility. Don't tell me we can't afford it. We can afford it. We can afford it. It's a matter of politics.